This is the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast with Cass Midgley.
We interview people you don't know about a subject no one wants to talk about. We hope to encourage people in the process of deconstructing their faith and help curb the loneliness that accompanies it. We think the world is a better place when more people live by sight, not by faith. Please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, you can support us monetarily in 2 easy ways. You can pledge
$1 million
or more through Patreon. That's patreon.com/EA podcast, or leave a lump sum donation through PayPal at our website, everyone'sagnostic.com. The smallest contribution is greatly appreciated.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 208 of the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast. I'm Cass Midgley, and this is my first show officially without Bob. I've done a few without him over the 4 years that we were on the air together, but this is it. This is embarking on a new thing, and you just heard the new intro, and hope you like it. I said I wasn't going to put out a show this week because last week's episode with Bob and the death episode was long. And, we just thought this will be enough. And I ended up having a lot to say this week. I ran across a couple of things that moved me. So I thought I'd share them with my friends. There's no guest today. I want to talk about the response to Bob's departure, and especially the audio tribute that was distributed and featured at the tail end of that episode. It really provoked a lot of love for Bob, and I just want to say I loved it, and he loved it, and you guys really love-bombed him. You nuked him with your love, and it was moving to see, and especially touching for Bob. So thank you very much for making the time and effort to bless him and to just commemorate what a wonderful chapter of this show. 4 years he and I will never forget, and there's just no way to say thank you enough. The 2 audio clips that I'm sharing today are a talk from Tara Brach that she gave at a retreat recently, and a recent diatribe from Lugeons from his podcast, The Scathing Atheist. As Bob and I talked last week, I love the Hegelian dialectic, contrasting 2 seemingly opposite things and forming a third, entirely different thing out of that clash, not unlike mammalian reproduction. Well, Tara Brach and Lugeons are not necessarily opposites, but they contrast starkly. She's an American psychologist, a proponent of Buddhist meditation, and founder of the Insight Meditation Community in Washington, D.C. Noah is the founder and co-host of the Scathing Atheist podcast. Each week he begins the episode with the Diatribe, which is a solo rant he writes himself, and they are genius. Whether you agree with him or not, his writing is amazing, as is his intellect. Here in a bit, I'll play his diatribe from episode 279, where he addresses Attorney General Jeff Sessions getting up and quoting the Bible to justify separating children from their parents. And it's about 7 minutes. After that, a 45-minute talk by Dr. Tara Brach. I pulled this description off her website. Quote, "This talk explores how we can undo the identification with thoughts, emotions, and feelings that keeps us landlocked and unable to trust and live from our naturally loving and radiant essence." Unquote. In other words, we are less artificial and more authentic versions of ourselves when we stop trusting what our thoughts, emotions, and other people tell us we are. She's a bit woo-woo, new agey, little Buddhist-y, but I love her. And remember, she has a PhD in clinical psychology from the Fielding Institute, so she's not just pulling it out of her ass. And before we get into those talks, a couple of things. One thing about social media and podcasts, and for me, NPR, these are places where we get plugged in. into the zeitgeist of our culture. Our friends, people that share our values, they feed us stuff that stretches us, encourages us, enlightens us, edifies us. And in this fucked up world with everything seemingly going to hell in a handbasket, we need some sanity. We need some hope. We need to laugh. We need to feel. We need to be reminded that we're human, and some people on this planet are still human, that we're still connected. The pressure to disconnect from each other is so strong these days, but even our enemies are only seen that way because we've othered them. I know that the American government is run amok right now, and there seems to be no accountability or checks and balances, and power is being abused by people who have lost their sense of interconnectedness with their fellow humans. And yes, we need to find ways to convey to them, since they seem to be above the laws that normally would rein this kind of shit in, that this kind of behavior done in the name of our community, America, by people employed by us, it's not right. And if that means the private sector saying to the public employees, no, you cannot eat in my restaurant, so be it. Bakeries refusing to bake cakes for gays is not the same as restaurants refusing to serve government employees who are out of control and out of touch. Gay people are not the employees of bakers. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is an employee of the people, by the people, for the people. They work for us, and when they're out of bounds, and Congress and Senate aren't doing anything to stop them, little old restaurant owners or you and I or any other little people are doing us a favor when they find creative ways to send a message that is heard loud and clear and wide. The future of this community may depend on it. What I started to say about our community feeding us things from which we benefit, I was told several times this week to watch two things. One, Karaoke Carpool with Paul McCartney on YouTube, and two, Hannah Gadsby's stand-up comedy show on Netflix called Nanette. I'm not going to comment on them. I'm just passing that along. I watched both, and I'm a better man for it. Okay, another thing I want to insert here. Every night, I take walks at night, and often I set up my phone to record me talking to myself. I like to talk, and it helps me untangle the spaghetti mess of interwoven thoughts, ideas, and philosophies that bang around my head like a pinball game with 25 ball bearings. And talking about them is the only way I can drain the game of them. So here's a lap around the block of me talking into my phone about shit I want to talk about. Audio-wise, it's janky, but I think you'll get the gist of it. Just a little bit about irony. Irony, I think even Hitchens, when he was listing some of the greatest things about life, irony was one of them, and it was kind of the odd man out. It was, he probably said sex and eating and sunsets and irony.
The questioner asks, if God does not exist, what then is the purpose of life?
Well, I can only answer for myself. What cheers me up? I suppose mainly gloating over the misfortunes of other people. And then there's irony, which is the gin in the Campari, the cream in the coffee. Sex can have diminishing returns, but it's amazing. No, that's pretty much it, and then it's a clear run to the grave.
I've always thought irony was interesting, but one of the best things about life. But it's true because, for example, when you get to a place where you're all out of fucks, in some ways, and this is the semantics of it, but you don't care. You don't care. You're all out of fucks. You don't care anymore. And it's on the other side of that threshold where you actually, ironically, begin to have a care that is coming from a place of power and strength and confidence and security and rest. You're not striving. You're not kicking and scratching for attention, or you're not so given over to everybody else's needs that you care, or you're not a people pleaser because you're trying to fill the black hole of your own personal self-hatred and you care. So it's almost that irony of I don't care and now I can start caring. And similarly, the reason that I say yes saying to what is when people have read like the boundary book, or they understand boundaries, and that all their life they've said yes, and kind of going back to that same people-pleasing type thing, is that you're always saying yes to people, and how empowering it is to throw up a boundary and say, no, I exist, I'm not a welcome mat, or something that can just be trod over. I'm here, goddammit, I'm substance. Unlike the lost boys of Peter Pan, I cast a shadow. I'm here, and you're not going to run over me, so no. And that feels powerful. But on the other side of that is you can start saying yes. You can start being vulnerable. You can start letting people in, because again, you're coming from a place of power and a place of strength. And the irony is that you come full circle, you come back to a place where you say yes to people. And, they say this about friends at their funeral. They say, he would drop whatever he was doing and come to my aid. That was a true friend. And, when I hear that over the years, I've thought, okay, was that somebody who had no boundaries? Or is that truly a powerful person that had made other people's lives have value to them? And the irony is that we don't get there the Christian way, which is lay down your life and you are an empty vessel and you are nothing and there's no good in you and only Jesus, working through you can do any good. You come through the humanism way, the amazement and the awe of what it means to be human. Given the evolutionary process, it's a fucking miracle that we're here and that we are what we are and that we're conscious beings, sentient, breathing in and out. It's amazing what we are. And when we know that, and we turn around and say yes to our body shape, our sense of humor, our level of intellect, we say yes to what it means to be us. Yeah, we're surrounded by people judging us, but we are out of fucks. And so we just show up and we be. And there's this thing that says, I need for you to be present. Well, sometimes I don't want to be present. And I'm going to do me. And if you had the two legs to stand on to do you, then we both could coexist on this planet without any codependency or leaning or needing each other. Thus, when any of us ever did a kind fucking gesture, we knew that it was real and that there were no strings attached, no expectations. Somebody's starving ego wasn't getting fed by it. We know who we are. We're empowered, but we use our power to reassess our values, to begin to act on them unapologetically and unaccountability. We're not accountable to anybody for what we value and how we play those out. Unless, of course, it's against the law or you're invading on someone else's rights. But when it comes to just living day in and day out, people could say, oh, you weren't very present at that meeting. And I can say, I wasn't. For whatever reason, I didn't have what it took to be present. I'd gone inward. And something in my body must have felt the need to go inward and deal with me, cope with me. My essence felt like it needed to disengage. And maybe next time I'll be more present, maybe not. But are you the kind of friend that is constantly rating whether you want to be my friend or not? Do you love the thought of me or do you love me? There is a place where we get to where we just make a decision. I'm off the fence when it comes to how I feel about you. I'm not evaluating every moment of my time with you to decide whether I like you or not. I've either already decided that I like you and I'm all in, or I find you uninteresting and I probably never will because you don't have it within you to be interesting to me, and that's not an indictment on you. That's you doing you and me doing me. And it just so happens that not everybody on this planet's going to be best friends. In fact, if you've got 5, you're lucky. So let's quit judging. Let's quit expecting others. Let's gird up our loins. Let's stop giving a fuck and then cross over into that place of empowerment where I can give a fuck whenever I want to. I can disengage whenever I want to. I can throw down a boundary when I want to. I can throw up when I want to. And I'm either going to be surrounded by people who get that and give me the space and freedom to be myself, or not. Okay, so as promised, here's No Illusions and his diatribe about Attorney General Jeff Sessions from the Scathing Atheist podcast, episode 279. There's a link to this episode in the show notes.
Well, of fucking course Sessions used the Bible to justify his heinous and unforgivable actions. He's Jeff Sessions. It's the Bible. And their heinous, unforgivable actions. Bacon, lettuce, tomato. And I get this story's a little played out, but it's not my fault that all the most despicably theocratic shit happens on Thursday, so I'm going to take a minute to swim around in it. So this saga all started when the Trump administration finally found out what you had to do to Hispanics before even evangelicals started getting sympathetic. And it's good to know that line exists. I was starting to doubt it. You know, leaving an island full of them without power or potable water for months on end didn't do it. Reneging on our promises to immigrants brought to the country as children didn't do it. Ripping parents who'd spent decades in this country away from their families and deporting them over decades-old dust-covered marijuana possession charges didn't do it. But pulling a nursing infant from a mother's tit apparently does the trick. And in the wake of those reports, even Trump's staunchest allies in the evangelical community started saying, hey, now, wait a second. And it was in response to that Jefferson Beauregard Sessions took to the lectern and offered up his biblical justification. And, of course, he went right to Romans 13, which can be aptly paraphrased as, now go wait in the truck and think on what you've done. And predictably, if not justifiably, this caused pretty much universal freak out in the media. Now, if they were freaked out because the Attorney General thought he could justify U.S. policy with biblical references, that would have been one thing. Right? If the headlines and commentary and outrage were with the theocratic notion that finding a justification in the epistles was sufficient, I'd have given the media a big pat on the back and moved on with my life. But as you know, that was not the case. I mean, a couple of people remembered here and there to point out that the Bible is not a binding legal document, but the bulk of the pushback was at the audacity of Jeff Sessions using such a moral tone to justify such an immoral act. In the Washington Post alone, I saw op-ed headlines declaring Sessions invents a faith all his own. This isn't religion, it's perversion. And leave the Bible out of it. Child separation is not Christian. All of that in the span of 3 days. When I searched Jeff Sessions on CNN's website in the wake of this, it directed me to clips of 3 pastors and a theologian disavowing Sessions' interpretation of the Bible. MSNBC's headline on the whole ordeal was just, Sessions misuses Bible to justify separating children from their parents. That was not an opinion piece, by the way. That was just their distillation of what was going on in headline form. And look, I'm not usually super inclined to come to the defense of the Bible, but be nice to immigrants is one of the few things it's actually clear on. I mean, assuming that this is one of those selective times when the Old Testament shit counts. You got Leviticus 19:34, the foreigner that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you. Exodus 22:21, thou shalt not exploit or oppress a foreign resident, for you yourselves were foreigners in the land of Egypt. You got Ruth 2:10, you can maybe Job 31:32. Again, there are remarkably few things the Bible takes a definite stand on, but that's one of them. The Bible repeatedly implores its readers to take pity on the refugee and not oppress the foreigner living in their land. I mean, it equivocates a little bit on Edomites whose babies you're allowed to smash against rocks, apparently. But in general, the Bible wants you to stop fucking with the immigrants. Of course, those pro-immigrant passages don't say, thou shalt stop only at ripping the infant from the breast of the refugee and holding it in an abandoned Walmart. It says you should take pity on the immigrant and treat him as you treat a citizen. And let's be super clear that the evangelical leaders are stopping way short of recommending that. But there is some biblical justification for their outrage. That being said, the Bible also contains Romans 13, which reads, quote, Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. What's that? The Bible taking contradicting views that are impossible to reconcile? The hell you say. And let's be clear here. This is also one of the things the Bible is super clear on, right? The whole Jesus story is about submitting to punishment for a crime you didn't commit, isn't it? Jesus could have miracled his way out of the Romans' hands, but no, he healed the dude that Simon Peter went all Vincent Van Gogh on and then went on to his death. He turned the other cheek. It's kind of his whole thing. So yes, Jeff Sessions is right for whatever that's worth. The Bible is on his side. Even when the government is doing something immoral, you're supposed to go along. It's part of God's plan. Donald fucking Trump is part of God's plan. Says so in Romans, which is probably why we don't use the fucking Bible to inform national policy. Pundits are getting all incredulous about this going, well, Jeff Sessions is using the same biblical passage to justify this policy as they used to justify slavery, as though that's more a problem with Jeff Sessions than it is with the Bible. I mean, hey, after you saw you could use your book to justify slavery, maybe you stop using it as a moral guide, right? Maybe we admit that trying to pluck your moral code from the convoluted, contradictory, cryptic musings of morally dubious authors from a time before we puzzled out the technological marvel of the goddamn wheelbarrow is just a doomed effort to begin with. But no, here we are, 153 years post-bellum, still laboring under the social delusion that a book that tells us to kill gay people and adulterers with rocks can somehow still be like overall moral, though. And when Jeff Sessions comes along with a glaring and unmistakable reminder that that can't possibly be true, rather than admit the fucking thing isn't moral, the media gets all red-faced and outraged, and it's just that Sessions is just doing it wrong. But let's be clear here. This whole fucking thing comes from the Bible. The evangelicals didn't abandon Trump when he called Mexican immigrants rapists or stoked fervor to wall our country off from brown people or ban whole religions from coming here. Through all of that, all the shithole country stuff, through all three versions of his Muslim bans, through the animals remarks, none of these guys were running to their Bibles going, hold on a second, I remember something in here about not exploiting the foreigners that live among us. They were all Romans 13, no Exodus 22. It wasn't until he started doing unmistakable cartoon villain shit that they were like, maybe not. And even then it took weeks. And even now, the majority of evangelicals support the policy. The whole reason we have Trump to begin with is people looking to their Bible for morals. This stain on American history is their stain. And what's more, it's all but an inevitable consequence of calling a document that tells you to own slaves, beat your children, and pay full market value for your rape victims the good book.
No illusions, ladies and gentlemen. I love me some Christians. I even love some aspects of Christianity and Jesus. But I also love it when bad Christianity gets taken to task, and no one does it better than No Illusions. Up next, Dr. Tara Brach, giving one of her Wednesday night talks up in Maryland, near where the shooting was this week. And as mentioned, she's a bit woo-woo. But I've listened to her long enough to know that she's not a theist, she's barely a deist, if at all. What she is someone smart and free to borrow language and terminology from any sector that serves her point. And she's not uptight or dogmatic about it in the least. She's just concerned about emotional health, happiness, and freedom, which makes her my friend. She's helped me a lot. A couple of vocabulary words in this talk are contract. And to Tara, this means the opposite of open up. And if you're brave and free and open, then you're not closed, fearful, or contracting. Also, secondly, the word identify. She uses the word identify a lot in this talk, and in a way that may not make sense to you in the context in which she uses it. What she's talking about with identify is the pitfall of getting your identity from without rather than from within. Now, you might think that your thoughts are within, but they're not. They're coming from your brain, which has a mind of its own. We each have an even deeper core identity that does not always identify with its own thoughts and reserves the right to discern thoughts, emotions, and outside advice. She's teaching us to live from a powerful, beautiful, interconnected core within, one that is not artificially propped up or led around with a ring through its nose by culture and society, or falsely kept alive by a ventilator. It has its own source, its own power, its own life, its own vibrancy and confidence, and it's all within us in our truest form. Okay, she's much better at saying that than I am, so I'll shut up, but I wanted to lay some groundwork so it would make more sense to you. And here's the talk by Tara Brach.
So I'd like to begin tonight with a poem. This is a new favorite of mine. I was meditating with my cat the other day, and all of a sudden she shouted, "What happened?" I knew exactly what she meant, but encouraged her to say more, feeling that if she got it all out on the table, she'd sleep better that night. So I responded, "Tell me more, dear." And she soulfully meowed, "Well, I was mingled with the sky. I was comets whizzing here and there. I was suns in heat. Hell, I was galaxies. But now look, I'm landlocked in fur." To this I said, "I know exactly what you mean." What to say about conversation between mystics? So the title of tonight's talk may have something to do with landlocked in fur. We'll go from there. So you might not have found over these days that you've been dissolved into galaxies of light, but many I know from our groups have sensed an openness and times of really feeling at home or with experience in a fluid way, and then contracted. And the next season has been one of, in some way, anxiety or tension or tightness, that something's wrong feeling. So one way of understanding, this whole awakening process, or even the word enlightenment, is freedom from that identification with the landlocked self, when we're not stuck inside a limiting story and felt sense of selfness. And you'll notice as you're moving through the day here that the moments that you feel most free, there's not a preoccupation with your story, with comparing yourself to others or to how you should be, with judgments. There's more of that kind of relaxed openness. We're just part of a flow. So, I'm curious in terms of language, how many of you are aware, at least some of the time, of when you feel kind of caught in a small identity, when you're living in something smaller than you know you are? Can I just see by hands how many kind of track that a little? Okay. That puts us in the same arena. So many of you might be familiar, I've mentioned this a lot of times in talks, if you've listened to them, of the palliative caregiver who described the greatest regret of the dying, one of the single greatest regrets, as being that sense of not living true to ourselves, living according to expectations, or living according to internalized shoulds, but not true. And when I say true to self, true to who we really are. And I've really come to sense how it's not just the dying with that regret, that I think all of us live with a sense of what's possible, who we can be, and some evaluating and sensing a gap, that right now I'm not living, my heart's not as open, or my mind's not as clear, and I'm not as present. And that's that something's wrong feeling. It's not the way it's supposed to be. The landlocked feeling. And when it's there, we're not trusting ourselves. One of the stories I love came from a Waldorf school that my son attended to, and they described that there was an art class and students were sitting in fours. I think they were third grade or fourth grade, and the teacher was kind of rotating around as the children were on a project drawing, and she stood looking over one little girl's shoulder because the girl was so into her picture. She was really into it. And the teacher asked her, "So what are you drawing?" And the little girl's response was, "I'm drawing God." And the teacher kind of chuckled and said, "Well, hon, nobody knows what God looks like." And without skipping a beat, without even looking up, the little girl said, "They will in a moment," you know. And what I like about that is there's this confidence when we're really sensing the who we are, when we're okay with ourselves. There's a real natural confidence that comes through. And it's a sign that we're just inhabiting our being. So tonight what I'd like to do, and this hopefully will build, you'll sense the building from this looking at the tightness of restlessness, worry, and then how important it is that we wake up through our bodies, and then the quality of compassion that's necessary. What I'd like to look at tonight is through the lens of identity. In a sense, really, this process of undoing a limiting identity. So if you're walking around in a story of insufficient self, or oppressed self, or victimized self, or will never get it right self, how do we wake up out of that? And I think one of the most powerful frames for the inquiry is simply sensing in this moment, is there anything between me and really living from the truth of who I am, or the wholeness of who I am, right in this moment? And when we inquire, when we start to observe with that frame, is there anything between? There's 3 domains that are particularly important to begin to investigate. And one of the domains, is there anything between me and really living in fullness, is the domain of stories. Often we'll find that there's a veil of stories going on, thoughts and stories about this character called self and how the world is. So that's one of the domains that can get between us and reality. And another domain is where we get caught inside reactive emotions, fears and wants. And then the third domain, as you might be imagining, is the domain energetically, of where we get caught and identified with contractions, energetic contractions, physical contractions. Now, each of these domains is a form of contracting. In the mind, when we get identified with thoughts, there's contraction. When we get identified with reactive emotions, we're contracting in the heart area. And when we get identified with contractions energetically, that's just another more subtle level, or more gross level, actually. And these together make up selfing. And selfing is a word that Ruth brought into the room that if you're not familiar with, it's just a useful word. For some people it's not, but it's not a derogatory word. It's just that there are these processes that keep reconstructing our sense of self. And they're really processes of contracting. And there's a familiar pattern of contractions that make up a familiar sense of self. How does that sound? Does that make sense? I'm kind of looking around. Okay, I got a thumbs up. Thank you. So we're going to look at selfing because really homecoming, coming back to our natural being, is undoing the identifications with those contractions. So that what happens is that when we come into presence, presence relaxes us open beyond the belief contractions. And you've begun to notice that. If you bring presence to your thoughts, you're going to wake up to something larger. And similarly, when we bring a kind presence to the contractions in the heart area, what happens? We kind of open to something larger. We might still feel fear, but we're not identified with it. And when we bring presence to the physical, energetic contractions, again, that presence creates a kind of a space around that allows the knots to loosen. So that's kind of the direction we're going in here. And there's a metaphor I really like that I'd like to toss into the mix here. which is to imagine, this is for the whole spiritual path, that it's like we are jumping off a plane with a parachute. Here we are, we come to retreat, or we practice this practice, we're jumping off a plane with a parachute, but then we realize that we don't have a parachute. And then we realize that there's no ground to hit. And then we realize there's no one who jumped. How are we doing? Are you all with me? We'll see how this goes. Just keep going together. So this is really a metaphor for undoing our familiar selfing. We kind of, instead of staying with our habitual beliefs and thoughts, we kind of are stepping out of them. And are we going to hit ground? Well, instead of resisting what's here, we open to the rawness. We open to the emotions. And then the more open we get, the more we discover there's nobody really it's happening to. And I'll just put that out there for now. You don't have to buy it. But here's something I want to make sure to touch into, that we had one very good question this morning that brought in the fear of that emptiness, that, well, when you say there's no one that jumped, that doesn't make me feel good. You know, that can be scary. So I want to name that this fear of emptiness or no self, you know, it's a natural evolutionary experience, and we emerge, we evolve, designed to perceive a separate self, and designed to cling to that separate self, and designed to defend that separate self. And so when we're introduced to a concept of, well, there's nobody there, that goes against that, you know, all those tens of thousands of years of evolution, that's what we were designed to experience. And it's not the end of the evolutionary story, because there is built into our capacities the ability to pay attention in a way that senses what we are beyond that separate self, and that actually encourages us to jump off the plane. Every one of you is jumping off the plane by being here, by even having any intention to be mindful, to pay attention to what's going on with presence. You're stepping out of the familiar cocoon of body-mind patterning. You're jumping off a plane. And to me it's interesting now, you know, when meditators are put under MRIs, and so they start showing what's happening in the brain, what they find out is that there's a deactivation of the parts of the frontal cortex that perpetuate a self-image and a sense of self and other and a duality. So what's going on in the brain matches that dissolution of self and that unit of feeling that meditators report as they go deeper and deeper into meditation. I'm just throwing that in there because I always think it's interesting how science is a metaphor that parallels so much of what meditators are finding out. Okay, so let's reflect on the domains of undoing the selfing, of sensing where we're landlocked and loosening the boundaries. And even as I've been talking about it, I've been pointing to areas of the body, and I just want to open up the possibility of exploring these domains of contraction. The domain of contraction, of getting caught in our beliefs and stories, is the domain of mind, okay? And the domain of getting caught up in and identified with reactive emotions is the domain of heart. And the energetic contraction, the most gross level of where we resist and hold on, is described as the dantian or navel area. And this is the area of willpower and of the basic clutch onto life. We'll talk about it more, but this is the area that I'm going to invite you to explore as we look at letting go of these contractions. So we begin with the area of stories and beliefs and thoughts, which Ruth really I thought gave a beautiful map of this morning of the ways we get caught and the ways we work with it. And I'm just going to add on a few different dimensions, and then we'll just experiment together. But one is just to say, well, what are thoughts? And what we know about on one level is they're electrical signals, neurons jumping the synapses, that kind of thing. We sense they're mostly sound bites and images, right? And I remember at my first retreat, one of the useful ways to think about thoughts was we were instructed to imagine that everything we were thinking was actually going on in the person in front of us. So I'm going to invite you to consider that. And if you're in the front row, you can use us. But, you might imagine that somebody in front of you is having a movie going on in their mind, and the movie's about some conflict with a colleague and how in some way they were dissed or let down and how they're angry about it and they have to go home and straighten it out. And if you imagine that's going on in another person's mind, and you imagine, okay, so there's this stories going on, and you know that person's body's feeling the fight, flight, freeze stuff that might go with the story, and you know that it might all lead to a certain kind of actions in the future. For you still know it's a movie. You know that it's not actually happening right now, but for that person, when they're caught in the movie, it's actually the reality. It's merged. Awareness actually is merged with the thought process, and they're living in a living reality in those moments, and their body's having experiences, and it feels real. And that wonderful phrase from Sokne Rinpoche that Ruth mentioned, real but not true, is the way to begin to loosen it. And we can sense how true that is when it's somebody else's movie. So how do we unstuck ourselves? Because most of the time, through most of the day, we're believing the movies in our mind. Most of the time. And we suffer because we're believing something that's not true. We're landlocked. And we're in a confining kind of set of thoughts. And often, the thoughts are really unreliable. The images and sound bites are really unreliable. And one of my favorite examples is this. Okay, this is written by somebody who's a bagpiper, and he says, I play many gigs. Recently I was asked by a funeral director to play at a graveside service for a homeless man. He had no family or friends, so the service was to be at the Pauper Cemetery in Kentucky backcountry. Now, I wasn't familiar with the back roads, got lost. Being a typical guy, I didn't stop for directions. And when I arrived an hour late, I saw the funeral guy had already gone. The hearse was nowhere in sight. There were only diggers and crew left, and they were eating lunch. I felt badly and apologized for being late. I went to the side of the grave and looked down, and the vault lid was already in place. I didn't know what else to do, so I started to play. The workers put down their lunches and began to gather around. I played out my heart and soul for this man with no family, with no friends. I played like I'd never played before for this homeless man, and I played Amazing Grace. The workers began to weep. I wept. We all wept together. When I finished, I packed up my bagpipes and started for my car, and though my head hung low, my heart was full. As I opened the door to my car, I heard one of the workers say, never seen nothing like that before, and I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years. So real but not true, right? Okay, so just a few pieces about, this trance we get into when we're caught in thoughts. And these are the key pieces on how they cause suffering. And the first feature is that when we're believing our thoughts, any time there's thoughts going on and we're kind of inside the thoughts, in those moments there's a sense of a self in here and a world out there. In other words, the very ground of duality is set up. We cannot feel true connection when we're believing or inside our thoughts. Okay? That's the first one. We're in this duality. It's often there's a separate lonely self. It's like in one joke, this guy is in a bar and he's talking to the bartender. He says, I know I'm nothing, but I'm all I can think about, That's the first one. The second one is when we're in the thinking trance, because of our evolutionary bias to somewhat fixate on the negative, on where there's going to be something wrong. When we're in the thinking trance, it's usually fear-based. In other words, it's not only having a separate self, it's a threatened separate self. In some way around the corner, something's going to go wrong. Okay? That's part 2 in the thinking trance. The third one is that our mind's designed to compare when we get into narratives, so there's usually a higher and a lower. I'm better, I'm worse. Good, bad, right, wrong. Okay? And then the last piece I want to mention, and this came up in the groups today, which I think is really important, is that when we're in a thinking trance, we're living in a map of time. There's a conceptual map that we're living in where we're on our way somewhere else, and we've come from somewhere. And some of you might have noticed there's not that many moments in our life when all the notions of a future and a past fade and dissolve, and there's just this openness of now. And yet those moments are when we actually touch into the nature that's here of loving presence, light, creativity. Everything we long for is when there's that boundlessness. It's right here. We're usually on our way. Norman Glass writes this: life is tough. It takes up a lot of your time, all your weekends. And what do you get at the end of it? Death, a great reward. I think the life cycle is all backwards. You should die first, get it out of the way. Then you live 20 years in an old age home. You get kicked out when you're too young. You get a gold watch, you go to work. You work for 40 years until you're young enough to enjoy your retirement. You go to college. You party until you're ready for high school. You become a little kid. You play. You have no responsibilities. You become a little boy or girl. You go back into the womb. You spend your last 9 months floating. And you finish off as a gleam in someone's eye. It's called reverse living. So Anam Thupten, who is with us for our last retreat, describes it this way. He says, can we see that there is a mental world that we have created somewhere in our consciousness? It is a mind-created world that we've been living in forever. The world we must transcend is the world that the mind has constructed. The problem are not thoughts, it's getting identified with them. And when they start creating our reality. So the first jump off the plane is where we just recognize, thinking, but we are no longer believing the thoughts are reality. So how do we undo the identification? Ruth went over a number of ways. The biggest way is the training we're doing here. Over and over again, we notice, lost in thought. And then we gently open out of the thought and we notice the difference between the thought and this here-ness, whatever this here-ness is. It might be that what we come back to is a clutch of anxiety, but we're not living in the mental concept. Waking up out of the thoughts over and over again. I love the question, am I dreaming? Because even if you ask it right now, am I dreaming? You get a sense of the veils. You get a sense of a little bit of a kind of conceptual, very subtle world that's between us and this immediacy, this real mystery right here. The deep teaching is be quiet and don't believe your thoughts, and don't believe your thoughts, and don't believe your thoughts. And one way you might consider it is this, and it's really remembering the space they arise from. Where did this thought come from? Where did it go to? So we begin to sense that we're the silence that's listening to the thoughts. The space that the thoughts are coming from and dissolving into. So this is the first domain of waking up out of the landlocked self, is undoing our identification with thoughts. Okay, that's part one. Second domain, the heart. So in the same way, emotions, just like thoughts, flow, happen, unfold, and we get stuck because awareness takes itself as the emotion. Oh, I am the wanting self. I'm the fearing self. I'm the ashamed self. Have you noticed when a strong emotion comes, that really feels defining? Okay? So it'd be nice if we could just recognize, oh, this anger, and it's just a weather system, just like those weather systems, and it doesn't really have something to do with the true me, but we don't do that, right? We identify. So the process of undoing that identification is to let go of any resistance to the actual feelings or felt sense. That's the process of undoing the identification, to let go of resistance to the felt sense. And that's what we've been doing a lot in this retreat with the introduction of rain. It's when we sense the emotions coming up and we feel ourselves gripped, rather than, keeping on the clutching, it's like, okay, recognize and allow it's there. And then as we begin to bring that presence, instead of resisting, where we begin to investigate and bring an intimate attention, there's a natural shift, a natural loosening, because we're not as identified. I'll use a story maybe to describe the shift in identity. Because I think that the N of rain, and some of you might have noticed this, it doesn't get enough airtime. Have you noticed that? Okay, so tonight's about the N of rain, really. How do we wake up out of a limiting identity? So we'll take one story and just look at how this process of waking up from a stuck emotion actually frees up our identity. And this is, I wanted to share a story I wrote up in True Refuge, because it's been with me lately. And this was a friend from college that contacted me after a number of years wanting some support with a life situation. He's an African-American man, a photojournalist, who married a Caucasian woman, and her family, particularly her father, her mother, her father was actually fine. Her mother was really very, very disturbed by them coming together and outraged, and when they'd visit, she was really rude to him. And his wife would say, we don't have to go anymore. In fact, she didn't want to go bring him and expose him anymore to the toxicity of her mother. But it was very much a part of his spiritual path there's a prayer for awakening. May whatever circumstances arise serve to awaken this heart, from the Tibetan tradition. And he just looked at it like, okay, let this wake up my heart. And there's another teaching that also made him stay in the game, which was Chogyam Trungpa had a kind of message which was, never give up on anyone. Okay, so he stayed in the game, but he wanted to work with me because it was bringing up childhood wounds that were as painful as you could imagine. When he was young, he felt very much not seen, not valued, a sense of not belonging. And then he went to college where I went, and he was in the minority there. And then he went into a profession where he was in the minority. So a lot of a sense of outsider and not deserving and not belonging. And here he was getting the message, you're an outsider, you don't belong, and, I don't want you. It was very, very painful. Filled him with a lot of shame and a lot of anger. So we practiced together. We explored feeling the depth of that wound and how did he want to be with it with himself, recognizing it, allowing it, as you've seen me do many times, that process of bringing, really feeling the clutch of it, and rather than resisting, bringing a deeply kind presence to it. And in that kindness, I mean, as he held himself, and he was really holding this very young child, he said he could feel himself going from the victim who is insufficient to the one doing the holding. That's the end of rain, where you move from the victim or the small, stuck self to that space of care. Okay? And so he decided he was going to go, when he did the next visit, which was Thanksgiving, he was going to bring his camera, because his camera was kind of an anchor. He could stay with his body, breathe with his feelings, feel himself here, but still look through it. And he'd look through his camera in a very benign way. So that's the way he did it. And he, as he described it, she continued to be rude. She wouldn't go out to eat at a restaurant because her friends might see her daughter and her daughter's husband together. It was really very painful and unpleasant. But he took pictures while he was visiting, and he felt like he got some good pictures. And how it turned out was they went back at Christmas. There was a gift exchange. The mother gave him socks that didn't fit and some chocolates, and he, not the kind of chocolates like cool dark chocolate, it was just junky chocolates. Anyway, but he gave her his gifts, and she opened them, and there were 2 framed pictures, and as she looked at them, she started weeping. And one of them, he had caught a picture of her playing with her new granddaughter, and she had this adoring expression on her face. And then in the other one, she had kind of collapsed into her husband's lap, and they were kind of cuddling, and she was happy. So he caught her goodness. He mirrored back her goodness. And as he described it to me, that as he was visiting and watching, he could see both, he could see her controlling self, the scared woman she was, and he could also see that when she could relax, how the goodness came out. And he caught her goodness, and that's what started melting her heart. She was seeing. Now, it didn't unfreeze immediately. Things like that don't. But that was the beginning of a thaw and it had come because he was resting in a larger identity. He had brought that presence to himself. He had unhooked his identity from the victimized self or the wounded self. So he was in a space where he could then be doing some mirroring, and that helped to start to unhook her. And what we find is that all of the domains of contraction are related. That as we have a contracted belief, we have contracted feelings in our heart area. So, as a way of beginning, you might bring to mind some place in your life where you're hooked on the sense that something's wrong with you. Where you get caught on that gap between who you should be or want to be and how you are appearing in your life. And just begin by recognizing how the mind holds it, where the belief is that you should be different, should be further along on the path, shouldn't cause harm to others, should be whatever, where the should is. And as you sense that belief, you might, just being mindful of it, even the words real but not true, might support you in that. Just so there's a little space around it. Let yourself open into where the contractions live in the heart area. And it may be the throat, the chest, the belly, wherever you feel them the most. But sense what it feels like to believe you're falling short. You might sense a bit of fear or shame or sadness, or maybe you're feeling numbness. Maybe it's not an accessible feeling. But let the intention be to relax any resistance. And just to open to what does it feel like? How does it feel in my body and my heart to feel like not enough, falling short, failing in some way, bad or wrong? And you might breathe with where you're feeling that. In some way, sense the possibility of, like a caring grandparent or like the Bodhisattva of compassion, just offering some understanding, some care to the rawness or vulnerability or felt sense of this. As you hold yourself in this way, you might sense the belief that was sticky, that you were believing, and just sense, well, who would I be without this belief? So we've explored two of the three domains, the unclenching of the identification with the beliefs and thoughts, and that opens up this mind or the chakras up there, this unclenching at the heart, opening up this area here at the heart. So the third area is this awakening at the navel, which really has to do with the most gross level of clutching, and it's that part of us, and some of you might have felt that, this kind of fist in the middle of the gut, or these layers of clenching muscles that when we're trying to soften our belly, it's hard because there's this armoring that's very, very primal level of defense. It's really the core grasping out of which every other level of grasping builds, and we're resisting aliveness. It feels dangerous and we're resisting. And I sometimes think of it that just coming into form's a shock. It can be a trauma. We're moving from this unlimited potential, and then it shocks consciousness. I mean, just imagine birthing, somebody grabbing at you and pulling you from the protected womb where you were floating, into this bright room and loud voices, and there can be a clutch in the gut. And then as we move through early life and not so early life, it can often be an inhospitable environment where we feel really not understood, more clutch, not seen, neglected, wounded. So it's a way of controlling and protecting. And I find that the more trauma, the more clutching there. Okay? So the movement towards awakening is to become aware of this energetic contraction. And you'll find it with the body scanning if you really pay attention, that there's that tightness there. And then what people come to me and say, well, I'm really feeling that, how do I get rid of the clutch? And the idea of trying to get rid of it gets in the way. And you've probably noticed that with everything, that if you run into fear, if you know that if you're trying to get rid of the fear knows that you're trying to get rid of it. And it digs in. So it's like the ego can't get rid of things. The ego's trying to get more comfortable, but it can't get rid of things. So I'll give you a kind of a sense of ways that we can open. And the story that came to mind to share actually is from a number of years ago. I was working with a minister, and he had kind of hit an impasse in his marriage. His wife wanted more intimacy and wanted him to be more vulnerable, to be able to, he had a hard time looking at her in the eyes and just saying, I love you. Just be in a present kind of way. He could say it in an offhand way, but to say it and stay with it, that was very, very difficult for him. She felt like he was very spiritually detached in some way. He felt that her wanting him to be more vulnerable and open and real was this kind of demand, and when he felt her demand, it made it even more difficult for him to open. And so he basically was living with a sense of never enough, like I can't satisfy her, because he'd make these efforts to try to bring a more of a closeness, and it was never enough. And so he was living in a lot of anger, and he'd blame her, and then deep down he'd blame himself. and it wasn't, the kind of thing that led to more coming together. So when we worked, I always start right with, it's like start where you are, started with the anger. And invited him to sense the difference between the angry stories and the anger as it lived in his body. So he was coming down, 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 okay? And the basic invitation was, when he felt his anger, is to let it be as big as it wanted to be. In other words, let it rip, right? Let. And so, again, he's a very controlled kind of guy, but I just kept saying, where do you feel it? How big does it want to be? What are you experiencing now? Until it started really, really ripping. It's like he said, okay, it's filling the room, it's blasting and dynamiting through the windows. It's like a tornado that's just like mowing down houses and churches too, everything. It's filling the East Coast, so it just got really, really big. And periodically he'd start getting quiet, and I'd say, so now what? And it just was going out there. But finally he got really quiet, and he said, okay, there's something underneath that anger. And so I said, well, what's going on now? What are you feeling? And he said, there's a fear that how I am is really not okay. And underneath the fear, because he kept saying yes, I mean, this is the way to the unselfing, is to keep saying yes to what's there. And selfing is basically a no to life. So if you're working at the Dantian, at the navel, it's like yes to this energy, yes to this energy. Okay, so what is it really like to say yes to that? And then he felt this depth of grief. The thought with it was, I'm losing loving, I'll never have loving. But there was this depth of grief that it was impossible. He couldn't have it. And he said, but if I open to this, it's like it'll be true. And I said, yeah, but it is true that you're feeling this. Can you say yes? So that's when there was a surrendering. And when I say surrendering, he surrendered into the energy, the reality of the energy that was there. And just let that grief be as big as it was. And in the bigness and the openness that the grief was filling, he started discovering a tenderness that he had not touched in as long as he could remember as an adult. Just a kind of vibrating, tender, open space. Their process was a slow one, because she had to do a similar process of this kind of insatiable needing somebody else to be different. And so she had her own process, but that was the beginning of their coming together. Mostly I'm sharing the story because the process of waking up out of the landlocked self at the navel is a deep kind of energetic surrendering into what is. And for myself, when I get caught in how I am is not okay, it's really not okay. It's not okay to be judgmental like this, or it's not okay to be selfish. And then I try to be different. And then I realize I can't. The ego can't make itself different. There's a kind of giving up that's a really healthy giving up. It's like, I give up. The ego can't do this. Do you see what I mean? It's like the self can't do this. And then in that giving up, in that to stop trying and surrender into the experience, then there's the possibility of real life coming through. There's a kind of handing it over. And I sometimes actually kinesthetically do this, where I'll actually take my hands like this, as if I'm offering it into the universe. It's like, I can't handle this. I can't stop this. I can't control this. Just let the universe do what it will with it. Anthony de Mello says, enlightenment is absolute cooperation with the inevitable. And Rilke says, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. So you get the feeling of how we work with this most core level clutching. It's this, let it happen. Just let life happen. The gift is this enormous aliveness and creativity of the universe can flow through us. We keep ourselves from less than alive, less than loving, and less than aware with this clutching. As we open it, it's like this aliveness flows through us that we belong to. We are that aliveness. And with that is this basic level of trust. Because until we let aliveness happen, we're always defending against it and thinking something bad's going to happen. But when we truly say yes, there's a trust that is incredibly liberating that comes with that. From Dana Folds. Trust the energy that courses through you. Trust, then take surrender even deeper. Be the energy. Don't push anything away. Follow each sensation back to its source in vastness and pure presence. Emerge so new, so fresh that you don't know who you are. Welcome in the season of monsoons. Be the bridge across the flooded river and the surging torrent underneath. Be unafraid of consummate wonder. Be the energy and blaze a trail across the clear night sky like lightning. Dare to be your own illumination.
Okay, that's my show for this week. A show that I wasn't going to do and didn't do until 2 days ago. But I love sharing stuff that I think will stretch you or make the world a better place. And yes, I know all preaching, teaching, and communicating is presumptuous, but where would we be without a little moderate dose of mental illness like narcissism, egoism, and histrionic disorder? Thanks for listening, and be a yes-sayer to what is.